there in fact began as the same creature. And then they split in different directions in the 19th century in works of popular literature, and then particularly in the 20th century in the world of film. The earliest published vampire story is from our Valvasor, from Glory of the Duchy of Carniola in 1689, and he tells the story of a guy named Jure Grando. Kudos to Proto-Slovenians like Valvasor for getting that right. And in case you happen to wake up in your tomb, you can ring the bell and hope somebody comes and quickly removes you. And I want to mention Jan Potocki, who is among the most famous Polish writers. So in 1815, Jan Potocki stole one of his mother's silver teapots, and he made a bullet out of it, and he had a priest bless the bullet, and he shot himself in the head with it. And he was convinced he was doing the world a great favor because he thought that he was a werewolf.
Have different clothes, behave differently, and act quite differently. How do we call this? And you have everybody else watching you. Well, we call it theater.
Dober dan, dobrodošli bomo danes v angleščini, da bo malo lažje zame in boste lažje razumeli verjetno tudi, ampak če imamo vprašanje, seveda lahko v slovenščini potem. Thanks so much for coming today. This is very exciting, my first time, and Svetlana's as well, at this conference. Have you done the tour yet to see all the booths?
No, not yet.
I did with my 11-year-old. It's very exciting, much more exciting than this talk, so she's not listening right now. So I'm going to start the first half of our talk today. And this talk is based on a book that Svetlana and I wrote a number of years ago as part of a series by the publisher Thames and Hudson, which is a British publisher that does beautiful art books, and they have series based on world myths. And we proposed doing Slavic myths, which has not been part of their series, and the book is absolutely beautiful. It's the most beautiful book I've ever done. You too, maybe?
Yep, absolutely.
And strangely enough, we recently got the Thai edition in the mail, which is also exciting. I'm not sure how many people in Thailand are interested in Slavic myths, but we'll take it. And if you're interested in getting the book, I don't believe it's for sale here, but you can order it on amazon.de, and it'll be here in a few days if you'd like. So the format of the book is we chose 8 famous Slavic legends, and we rewrote them in a new way. And then we have chapters that go into details about those legends. And what's interesting is that many of us know of some aspects of Slavic myth, maybe not realizing that the origins are in fact Slavic. So the 2 most famous Slavic mythological creatures that I'm going to talk about in the first half today, everybody knows well, but maybe not their origin stories, and those are vampires and werewolves. And each one takes up one of the chapters in the book. We also have chapters on the Slavic pantheon, on water creatures, on the firebird. We have a new version of Prešeren's Povodni Mož that we rewrote. Lots of fun stuff. So you can read it for the myths themselves, or you can read the chapters that go into more detail about them. And I'm going to talk to you today about the hybrid monsters of Slavic myth. For the first half, I'll talk about vampires and werewolves. And the big takeaway that I want you to understand that surprised me when I started researching is that there, in fact, began as the same creature. And then they split in different directions in the 19th century in works of popular literature, and then particularly in the 20th century in the world of film. So hybrid creatures, a lot of the creatures of ancient myth and various mythologies are hybrid. They're versions of 2 creatures put together, either half human and half something else, like a centaur, half human and half horse. Or here we have, anyone want extra credit points? What's the creature on the left? For 1 million extra credit points. Very good. Chimera, absolutely. And on the right, it's written there, so that's not quite the same. Anyone want to give it a shot? A manticore. These I chose randomly, of course, these are not Slavic, but to show you the idea of hybridizing, but also of combining human elements with an attribute of animals. And when we talk about mythological monsters, a lot of them are breaking categories. And one of the key things to keep in mind is a concept called liminality. And a liminal zone is somewhere that is between 2 opposites and not fully in any one of them. And Freud wrote about the dream world as a liminal zone. It's partly fabricated and partly an echo of the real world. And we humans have this habit of wanting to define things. And the term define actually means to set boundaries around. If you imagine, we understand that this is an iced coffee by inventing this definition of what it is and what it isn't. So everything that is not in this helps define by negative space what this is. And we have philosophers writing about this. Don't worry about we're not going to get into philosophy at all. But the idea that monsters occupy this boundary zone, this liminal zone, and that's why we find them disconcerting. And yet at the same time, we try to define them. It's nice to have little categories. You have your vampire section of your bookstore and your werewolf section, and it can get confusing if they cross over. But in fact, this crossover element is really one of the keys. We have this question with people who are, I said people, but figures who are accused of or actually vampires or werewolves. Are they a person? Are they alive or are they dead? Are they a demon? Are they your neighbor? Are they a disease? Are they some memory of violence? Or are they a combination of all those things? And in fact, they can be all of them. So some of the wonderful woodcut-style illustrations in our Slavic Myths book I've used to illustrate. So in modern horror, vampires and werewolves are separate species. But what we want to keep in mind is that myths present and preserve ancient anxieties about things that were concerns for people of the ancient world but are still today. So death, disease, fear of dangerous animals, sexuality, social disorder, and also the fear that the dead might not stay dead. And this was a problem until the 19th century. In the 19th century, we have fancy coffins that you could buy with bells attached to them that go above ground like a chimney, and there's a string that drops down into the coffin. And in case you happen to wake up in your tomb, you can ring the bell and hope somebody comes and quickly removes you. And this was a real concern up until the period when it was easier to clinically decree someone deceased. So part of the idea of where the concept of the undead or vampires emerging from the grave comes from is people who were either in a coma or were deemed deceased by locals, probably who were not trained doctors, and weren't actually dead, and literally rose from their graves when they woke up. And of course, this was very freaky for people. And rather than helping them, they decided to re-kill them in elaborate ways. So how do we re-kill them? Let me count the ways. I want to give you just a little bit of the pantheon of Slavic gods because few people know it, even us Slavs. It's much less popular than Greco-Roman, even Norse, Egyptian, Mayan. They tend to get more face time in popular myth. Comic books have helped with that, fiction and film. One of the problems with Slavic myths is the Slavic tribe, which emerged in what's now the Carpathian Mountains in Moldova and Romania, and very slowly spread both north, west, I always confuse east and west in Slovene and in English, and simply to the west. And we're such an enormous number that an ancient historian, one of those Strabo or one of the other, Svetlana actually knows about this stuff, and I had to learn with her to help write the book so she could fill this in, said that they were so numerous in number that wherever they walked, the grass ceased to grow. Probably a little bit hyperbole, but you get the idea. There's a lot of them. And there's so many of them that if you imagine how many countries in Europe now are effectively Slavic primarily, and it's a lot of them. And then we have divided into Russia, Baltics, the Eastern Slavic countries like Bulgaria, Poland, and then we have the Southern Slavic countries, Naše bratje, Yugoslavia, and the same traditions varied slightly, and names for places, heroes, gods would change. Then we have the attributes of them, and it's very nice to say that Perun is the Odin, Zeus, Jupiter of the Slavic world, but it's not quite that easy. Wouldn't it be nice if it were? But Perun is involved in thunder and storms and war and lightning, and he's got his whole arsenal of weapons. So is he Thor-like? Yes, but so he also has axes and spears and lightning arrows and all sorts of fun stuff. It would be nice to say that Veles is like Hades or Satan, but that's too simplified because Veles is in charge of the underworld, but he's also the one you pray to if you want to make sure your cattle stay healthy. And he has realms of magic and earth that are part of his world that he controls. So he's not the Slavic devil. He also is in charge of wet places, caves, swamps. But things that are nice too, like wealth and music and poetry, are all the realms of Veles. And then we have Vuk, who we'll talk about more. Vuk, of course, means the wolf. But this is not just an animal here. This is a sacred, dangerous, protective, divine, totemic animal for the Slavic tribes. And there's an element of worshiping wolves, but also becoming wolves. So we have, it's a shamanistic religion. So we have a pantheon of gods, but we also have the idea that there's a sacred divine nature to the natural world. So streams and rivers and trees. And we have shamans who would wear wolf skins and impersonate wolves and take on their power. We also have a tradition of people being given names that would confer some magical protection to them. So there are a lot of variations on the name Vuk that you can find still today in the Slavic world.
Vučić.
You jump in anytime. So when we're looking at werewolves, why wolves mattered, it's important to understand that in ancient through 20th century Europe, why were wolves important? This was the animal most likely to eat you in this part of the world. So this is why it was important. They were scary, but also something that you could summon to empower you. And it's one of these ideas, if you can't beat them, join them. So why don't we get the wolves on our side? So maybe they'll eat us a little bit less and we can have some of their powers. So we have children with wolf names. We have invocations of the wolf's protection or power. And then we have some interesting later repercussions of this. And I want to mention Jan Potocki, who is among the most famous Polish writers. He wrote what's considered one of the greatest works of Polish literature, the manuscript found in Saragossa. So in 1815, Jan Potocki stole one of his mother's silver teapots, and he made a bullet out of it, and he had a priest bless the bullet, and he shot himself in the head with it. And he was convinced he was doing the world a great favor because he thought that he was a werewolf. And this is not some like crazy kooky peasant from the boondocks. This is one of the greats of Polish literature. And he suffered from something that has later been called clinical lycanthropy. So lycanthropy is the term for were creatures, but it comes from an ancient Herodotus, Greek story, Lycaon, a king, an archaic Arcadian king. I keep looking at you so you actually know what you're talking about. Arcadian king called Lycaon, who thought that he would test the omniscience of Zeus, if Zeus really could know everything about everything. And how he was going to test him, he would kill one of Zeus's sons and cook him and serve him to Zeus for lunch. Seemed like a good idea at the time, I'm sure. And Zeus caught on very quickly, was not amused, and turned him into this either wolf or wolf-human hybrid. And that's the earliest story we have historically about some sort of wolf-like creature. But Herodotus also wrote about Scythians having dog heads. And we have a Slavic god called Psoglau, who has a dog's head. And these traditions intermix. It's easy to think of them as existing independent of one another, but there's a lot of intermixing. And so elements of one religion will get picked up in the other, and the mythos as well. We also have a later issue that I think Svetlana is going to talk more about, which is the fact that there's almost no ancient sources related to Slavic world. Those that are with us survived from cultures that saw the Slavs as a dangerous barbarian tribe that might try to attack them. And so you have to take their points of view with a grain of salt. That most of them were Byzantine scholars under Emperor Justinian I, writing about the various enemies of the Byzantine people and what we needed to know about them. And then we have Christianized versions of Slavic myths that were passed down orally and then written up in a Christianized era, but also in the 19th century when we have the Spring of Nations, where we have Slavic ethnic groups in national territories suddenly deciding I don't necessarily want to be Habsburg forever, and gaining independence and looking for origin stories that would give them a sense of tradition and a foundation on which to build their own independent Slavic nation. And then we have the first attempts to write down a lot of these ancient oral stories that they would have heard from grandmothers and mothers and so on. But then they're writing it with a Christian slant and also a sort of political slant, that these are origin stories. The most famous one is Libuše, as the founder of Prague. Praga means a threshold, and it's one of the stories we tell in our book. And now if we read it, it seems obvious that it was superimposed after Prague had already been established as a Slavic capital. And we wonder what the story might have been before that was the case. So we have this clinical lycanthropy. A lycan or a lycanthrope could be someone who thinks they are an animal. If anyone's read Dracula, probably everyone in this room at least once, right? Renfield, the character who thinks he's a spider, suffers from clinical lycanthropy, and he's in a mental institution because of it until Dracula busts him out. Or a lycanthrope could be a were creature, a werewolf, a werebear, or anything else you like. In the middle, we have one of the woodcut prints of Lycaon, the ancient king who was transformed by Zeus. And we have the idea of a humanized hybrid human-wolf creature called a werewolf that walks on hind legs is quite different from the ancient idea. It was more a concept that a human could turn into a wolf, and they could do this voluntarily, in which case they're called an animagus. They could do it if they're cursed, or they could do it some third way that's I'm not remembering, but I'll get back to you on okay. So we are going to shift briefly from wolves into vampires. And it's important to understand that Dracula did not invent really anything about vampires. Dracula, it's 1899, I think. It's after a very long tradition of vampires being part of initially ancient Serbian folk traditions that were first written about. The earliest record we have of an official report trying to make sense of Serbian rural behaviors is from an Austrian official in 1725 who was very confused about all these locals are doing. And they're writing about what they're doing. They're going around and re-killing people who recently died because they're thinking that they're vampires who are attacking villagers. And this might sound kooky, but when it's written up by an Austrian bureaucrat who is taking all the notes, and then it got published in Viennese newspapers because, of course, it's an interesting story, exactly what was going on, it fascinated people, and it immediately picked up into vampire literature. So I'm going to read you a very short excerpt from our book because I think it's fun to hear about some of the earliest vampires, and also the fact, and this is left out of some big sources like the Oxford English Dictionary neglects to mention this, but the earliest published vampire story is from our Valvasor, from Glory of the Duchy of Carniola in 1689, and he tells the story of a guy named Jure Grando. And I actually know a Slovene named Jure Grando, so he's still around today. But this story supposedly took place in 1672 in the village of Krink in Istria. In the town of Krink, the night after the burial of the freshly dead Jure Grando, a priest named Father George was enjoying a post-funeral meal with the widow Grando and other relatives. On opening the door to leave, the priest saw the dead man sitting behind the door, at which point he fled. Jure was then spotted by numerous former acquaintances over the following few weeks, usually going from house to house, knocking on doors throughout the town. Residents of the houses on whose doors he knocked began to die, and the locals were not happy about it. Even the widow Grando claimed to have seen him and slept with him before turning to the local sheriff, Miho Radetic, the first recorded vampire hunter, for protection. Somebody's got to make a movie of this. It'd be really fun. It gets better. A team of 9, quote-unquote, according to Valvasor, courageous neighbors, strengthened by quantities of strong spirits, schnapps, set out carrying 2 lanterns and a crucifix. They opened Jure's grave only to find, quote, the corpse's face flushed red. He turned and looked at them with a smile, then opened his mouth. All 9 vampire hunters freaked out, understandably it must be said, and ran. the sheriff came to his senses, and Valvassor Riley comments, quote, was annoyed to find that 9 living men could not handle a single dead one and were transformed into rabbits at a single glance. There were apparently several traditional methods of re-killing vampire corpses. The first one Sheriff Miho tried was to impale the suspiciously rubicund and mobile corpse in the stomach with a stake made of hawthorn wood. But Yura proved too resilient, the stake bounced off his stomach without piercing it. Time for plan B. Sheriff Miho summoned a priest who performed an exorcism rite, holding aloft the crucifix by lamplight and shouting repeatedly, "Here is Jesus Christ who saved us from damnation and died for us." Yure's corpse began to weep. Another member of the team then tried to chop off Yure's head with a garden hoe, but he went for it half-heartedly. In stepped a local authority, Marshal Milicic, who used the hoe to, quote, send the dead man's head flying. Valvassor is not shy about projectile body parts and was clearly having fun writing this story. As soon as it was severed, the head began to, quote, scream as if it were still living, and the grave filled with blood. And in a wonderfully matter-of-fact coda, Valvassor concludes the episode writing, quote, and from that point on, Grando left his wife and other folk in peace. So I love how gory and vivid the story is. It's super fun to read, and it is the earliest one we are aware of. So kudos to Proto-Slovenians like Valvassor for getting that right. This is also a time where we have some other stories. I won't go into detail because I'm going to pass the mic to Svetlana in just a few minutes. But one thing to keep in mind is the record, once again, is not from the locals. These are very probably uptight and frightened Catholic Austrian bureaucrats in rural Serbia dealing with people whose traditions combine leftovers of ancient Slavic paganism with Orthodox Christianity. And the idea of unburying a corpse from a cemetery was so anathema to the idea of these Austrian Roman Catholics that was part of their revulsion at the idea of what was happening. But they write about this with an eyewitness tone, and that helped give it a sense of credence, especially when it was republished in newspapers, then in compilations of vampire stories. And they first started out, these were apparently eyewitness accounts, and there's some others, I won't go into detail, but Peter Blagojevic died and then was annoying the locals, and then the story, they opened his grave. There were little to no signs of decomposition. His face was flushed with blood, his hair and nails were growing, and they had to drive a stake through his heart and burn the corpse. And then another named Arnold Paule was a former soldier or hajduk who had fought against the Turks and came back apparently having been bitten by a vampire, and was attacking both people and livestock and had to be dispatched. And then the story that we tell is of Sava Savanovic. Has anybody heard this story? It's a really good one. It's probably the most famous of Serbian vampire stories. I won't go into detail, but it's a lot of fun, and it was a lot of fun for us to rewrite. It is the first story in our collection. So if we fast forward a bit, we have these eyewitness accounts. We have some other eyewitness accounts that delve into myth. We imagine that the Jure Grando story started as something eyewitness, but unless you choose to believe in the reality of vampires, which you're entirely welcome to, then it's probably an exaggerated version of something that really happened. But the Austrian officials were not making things up. So it's not that the Austrians believed in vampires. They were trying to explain why the locals were doing this crazy stuff that they thought was anathema. And we get then fiction about vampires. And the most famous first one is by John Polidori, who was the personal physician to Byron. And he was part of the group with Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley, who were vacationing one summer in Switzerland. It was raining all the time, so they weren't at the beach, so they read each other ghost stories. There was a German book of ghost stories, and then they made a game that they would each write their own ghost story, and the most famous one is Frankenstein, which Mary Shelley wrote then, and John Polidori wrote one called The Vampire, which was then basically inventing the idea of the suave seductor vampire based on Lord Byron himself, and it was published possibly by Polidori, possibly not, as a work of Byron's, and Byron was the most popular, the Taylor Swift of his time. So he was universally popular. That's a weird analogy, but you know what I mean. And so it became very popular indeed. And there were loads of other works leading up to Dracula written by Bram Stoker, who was an Irish stage manager and manager of the most famous Irish actor of the time, Henry Fielding, who Dracula was based on. And he combined the idea of this historical figure named Vlad Tepes, or a Wallachian nobleman, who was also a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was founded by the Counts of Celje. And I always read that much and nothing more. Nobody seems to know what the Order of the Dragon did. Very intriguing, but it's fun to mention it, and Vlad Tepes was a member, so lots of Slovenian connections. Okay, just to finish up for now, the second story in our book is about werewolves, but in fact, the two figures are one and the same. And I want to mention Vuk Karadžić, who it's very difficult to overstate how important he was to legend, ethnography, and linguistics from this part of the world. He was banished from Serbia and lived in Vienna from 1810, and he wrote a Serbian dictionary that was published in 1818. And he's got not only words in it, but very elaborate descriptions of traditions and historical elements. And I thought I would just read you, before I pass this to Svetlana, what he wrote about werewolves/vampires, and it helps understand why they were conflated. So a werewolf is a man who 40 days after his death is inhabited by some devilish spirit and returns to life, vampirizes, becomes a vampire. So he's saying a werewolf starts vampiring, basically. Then he rises from the grave by night and sucks blood from people in their homes. An honest man cannot become a vampire unless a bird or any other animal wanders across his corpse. Therefore, the recently deceased are always guarded so that animals do not cross them. Werewolves usually appear in winter from Christmas to Spassodan, where Christ rose from the grave, part of the Easter tradition. When people start dying in large numbers in a village, rumors swirl that a werewolf is in the graveyard, and some will swear they saw him, wearing his funeral shroud draped over his shoulder at night. And you can start to see, there's a lot going on here, but the key things, werewolf and vampire are interchangeable vocabulary. A burial shroud over his shoulder is where we get the idea that vampires have a cloak or a cape and are flying around, okay? And they start guessing he's a vampire. Sometimes they take a young black stud horse without patches on its hide, and they lead him to walk over graves in which they suspect a werewolf could lurk. They do this because they say that such a stud will not and could not walk over the grave of a werewolf. If they are convinced that they've identified the grave, it happens that they open the grave. All the villagers gather with hawthorn stakes, for he only fears a hawthorn stake. As a saying goes, quote, "Let him find hawthorn and madder on his way," because hawthorn grows above madder. And then they open the coffin. If they find a man who did not decompose, they run stakes through him, throw the remains into a fire, and let it burn. They say that sometimes they'll find a werewolf who grew fat, bloated, and rubicund with human blood. A saying goes, as red as a vampire. A werewolf might visit his wife, especially if she is pretty and young, to sleep with her. And they also say that a child conceived with a werewolf will be born without bones, whatever that looks like. In times of hunger, a werewolf is often seen around mills, wheat, and corn reserves. So we have this hybridization. And one of the key things that everybody here has read Harry Potter 1,000 times, right? Probably. Okay. He who must not be named, the idea that somebody's name is so scary you can't say it. Well, the term vukodlak was considered, for werewolf or vampire, was considered so scary that you shouldn't say it. And you'd say vampire instead. So the terms, the characterizations, this person who rises from the dead and feeds on the living, and has to be re-killed, and the idea that they can transform into, in Slavic tradition, a black dog or a wolf. The idea of transforming into fog or a bat comes around later. They're essentially hybridized. And I'm exactly on time to pass this over to Svetlana. I thought I would end with this clip. Hopefully there's no sound to it. If I can play it. There is sound, okay. That's okay. This is Lon Chaney in the original The Wolf Man, and this is the Hollywood version of it, just to end with. But there's one story that somebody should make into a graphic novel, and it's about Tis of Kaltenbrunn from Livonia, who was on trial in 1692, and he claimed that he and a team of other werewolves descended into hell 3 times a year to fight witches and wizards so that the harvest would be protected. Somebody in this room, please write a graphic novel about this because it's super badass. And he was considered a good werewolf, so good, in fact, that he was only whipped and not executed. So good things come to werewolves who fight witches on our behalfs in hell at least 3 times a year. So I think while this is running in the background, this is about 2 minutes long, you're going to see his transformation. I will pass the mic to Svetlana.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you to move the slides for me?
Yes, of
Because
course.
I can't reach it. So while the werewolf is becoming himself, I'll tell something that is not a story, but if you want a description of what we are here now, who we are. Basically, the fear of dead is not a new invention. It's very old, it's ancient. But in antiquity, as we have the testimonies, they were afraid of all dead. So there was a very special ritual early in spring and in the Mediterranean area, Greece and around Mediterranean, it's end of February. It's a time when flowers pop out from earth, and these flowers, in fact, represent the souls of dead. This is the idea that Europe has forgotten, but it has an enormous meaning. So what do you do to defend yourself from the dead coming out as flowers? Well, first of all, you try to be unrecognized by them. So you wear differently, cosplay. You act differently. Well, you become slightly mad. Third, sure thing to do is to get drunk. Then you're certainly different. So what do you think about the situation in which you have different clothes, behave differently, and act quite differently? How do we call this? And you have everybody else watching you. Well, we call it theater. The origin of theater is just in that ritual. And to conclude this little story, to make you think about yourself in a theater, ritual theater, in Athenian democracy, which was a very specific democracy, very, very rarely renewed, because it was simple and direct, theater was the part of democratic institutions. So a citizen, which unfortunately was only male, would go to the courtrooms, to the assembly of all citizens, to other institutions of democracy. And then in February, there are festivals of theater, and everybody who is citizen would be there, from the richest to the poorest. The poorest would be allowed without paying. They had to go to the theater. And the rich were supposed to buy, to finance all the show, all the performance, or to buy worship, whatever. So just to conclude this little story, paradoxical story, to make you think about it, theater is necessarily linked to democracy. So we here, with cosplays and being different and slightly drunk, we are democracy.
That's right.
Now, I go to my topic, which is more serious and very depressive, in fact. And it is about hybridity, and how hybridity, being the only mechanism that we have in our imagination, our poor, miserable human imagination doesn't have anything else but hybridity. And this hybridity, of course, being poor and simple and vulgar, is very rich in different topics. And one of them, the ways how hybridity works in our civilization, starts, of course, in antiquity with perfectly formed, designed bodies of hybrid creatures, which are made of animals and humans. Usually, sometimes only of animals, sometimes of animals and humans. And, of course, the best known is centaur. And this is a centaur from Olympia, from the Temple of Zeus. This is the fight between humans, tribe from Peloponnesus, and centaurs at the end lose. So we can go further. That's Tryphon, and that's a creature made of birds, snakes, fish, donkeys, and human, which is a good hybridity model, and the guy was especially evil. He would destroy all cities with all of his collected powers. So we go then first, then. Yeah, well, you recognize the same guy. There's no much difference. In fact, where did our imagination go after 2,000 years? Nowhere. It's the same. There's no difference at all. So yes, I'm insisting on our miserable imagination because it gives the opportunity to think beyond hybridization, and that is interpretation. Let's go further. Then, of course, one of the best stories of how hybrid creatures, sirens, and sirens in ancient Greece are not half fish, half woman, mermaids. No, they're half birds, half women, and they sing, which is logical. So mermaids are usually mute, or they speak something in the movies similar to dolphin language, if you remember. But these sing, and they also have instruments. And Odysseus, Ulysses, is represented here tied because he wanted to experience these songs, and all the others who row have something in their ears, cotton or some other material who would make them completely deaf. But he was there to listen to their songs. And of course, the song was extremely seductive and would lead mariners to clash against rocks without any apparent reason. So we go further. Any difference? Again? Well, again, 2,000 years of the same. We go then. And this is one of the best, because this is Nereus, an old man from the sea. That's his epithet. And he is supposed to have the knowledge of everything. And he's half fish, half man. But to be clear about his character, he's also holding a fish. So I'm a fish, I'm holding a fish, and I know everything. I don't know if you remember a song by Iggy Pop for the movie Arizona by this Yugoslav director. And it's The Fish Knows. That's the refrain of the song, The Fish Knows. Well, this is the fish who knows. How do you extract the knowledge, this is a funny detail, from someone who knows everything and doesn't want to tell you? You squeeze them. You take them into your arms and you squeeze them. And in Greek, the same term, like holding someone, squeezing someone, is for the sexual relation. So basically, getting knowledge is making love. Okay, we go. Think about it, with the fish in your hand. So now we go to hybridity, which is tied to artistic professions. And this hybridity goes today, we are talking about the modern contemporary hybridity, goes among genres and among forms, among artistic forms. This one is the poster for the film by Roger Corman called A Bucket of Blood. I don't know if anybody saw this. It's absolutely necessary for you to see this movie from the 59, if I'm not wrong. And it is about the guy, the completely insignificant guy who serves as a barman in a club in which beatniks come to enjoy. I don't know if anybody knows who beatniks were. Yeah, well, they were the phenomenon, the alternative of the time in the United States. So this guy kills someone by chance, not by willing to kill, and then he tries to cover up his crime by molding the dead body into the clay. And then he exposes this sculpture in the same club. And beatniks are absolutely stunned. They love him as the artist. So, well, then he thinks and brings more bodies. But of course, he has to kill them beforehand, which he does, and then brings the guys or the girls to the public and becomes a very famous artist in beatnik circles. In fact, he sells his art forms very well. And at the end, he's discovered, of course, he's killed by the others and so on and so on. You can imagine, but it's a wonderful movie made by Roger Corman, who knew that he took the idea from the comics. So the poster is presenting the film as a comic book, as a story which is told in pictures and little clouds in which texts are put. So he was totally aware of what he was doing. And Roger Corman is, I would say, the hybridization genius of the film industry in the 20th century, because he was the author of Little Shop of Horror. You probably know this one. Well, The Bucket of Blood is better, I must say. And he made some really famous gory movies, but he also produced a huge amount of movies. The next thing, which is to his glory, is that he, in fact, put into the movie industry a number of geniuses, like Francis Ford Coppola, like Peter Bogdanovich, and some other who were his assistants. And this hybridity in which he was swimming very freely and very successfully and very quickly brought about a number of movies from which the series of Edgar Allan Poe literary works are the most famous. So you can find these films on internet by Roger Corman. Go and watch them. They're really chefs-d'oeuvre, they're really good, they're really interesting, and they do present this hybridity, which is something that, in fact, grows from simple horse-man combination, grows into hybridity of genre, hybridity of art forms, hybridity of, if you want, different concepts. That's what Roger Corman was doing. And the best example, we can go further, the best example of his work, his hybridization work, is his use of a Soviet sci-fi movie, which was called The Planet of Tempests. And The Planet of Tempests, which is slightly based on Shakespeare's Tempest. Well, all of them are. Everything that is about nature rebelling is based on Shakespeare's Tempest. And he bought this movie from Soviets in the 60s, in mid-60s. He bought it, he paid. And then he slightly changed the movie, putting the English-American context, an English actor and an English actors take parts of the scientist who follows the flight of the spaceship and the woman who communicates with the crew of the spaceship. And then he transformed the Soviet movie into an Americanized film, which is based on Soviet movie entirely, but entirely. And of course, the names of the Soviet actors are not mentioned. So he made this. 2 years later, because he already bought the thing, he made another version. This was Voyage to the Planet, well, that's the second, Voyage to the Planet of the Prehistoric Women, in which young Peter Bogdanovich added to the movie scenes with some chicks with very blonde, white, long hair, and little covers for the upper part of the body made of shells. And these chicks jump to the water, get out from the water, and represent the female prehistoric population of the planet. So, in fact, you have the three movies, the Soviet movie, the first Roger Corman movie, and the second Roger Corman movie. And, well, after viewing all this, I must say that the funniest is the Soviet movie. And all the three movies have the same character, which remains same all the time, and it's a robot. So you see these different levels of hybridization which really make us love the hybridization and not regard it as our main incapacity of imagining things. So we go further. That's the Soviet. That's a Soviet poster of the Soviet movie, which is absolutely lovely. It is a prehistoric planet. This is Venus, in fact. The film was made at a time when the Soviet satellite or the spaceship without crew came to Venus. And I remember my old professor saying, not without pride, the Cyrillic alphabet had reached Venus. I love that. So let's go further on slightly. And here we come to our book. I was very lucky to meet Noach and to work with him because he has something that, of course, I don't have. And this is this vast Western literary talent which covers all kinds of generations of different texts in his head. And he's also a specialist out of mythology, which we were working on. He's a specialist of art theft, how to steal the art objects and what to do with them afterwards. So he's the world authority in this. So for me, when we were talking about this book, this idea of hybridization was linked to what he was doing. And I went further. For me, hybridization was a simple concept of horseman, good design, good Greek design. But in talking and working with Noach, hybridization also became all kinds of stealing, imitating, mimesis, borrowing, transforming, making the world larger, much, much larger and much, much richer. So at the end, I can only conclude that, in fact, hybridization, which I hate conceptually, did show, just in our work, how many different things you may say with hybridization. And my favorite example from the book is the Czechoslovakia, and then painter Alphonse Mucha. And Alphonse Mucha went to Paris and became very popular, very rich, very famous by painting very amiable, pretty, just pretty women and advertising. He was a specialist in advertising, a secession advertising, Art Nouveau advertising, and his name was Alphonse Mucha. So Alphonse Mucha, at a certain moment, gathered his money and the money from his American mecena, went back to Czechoslovakia, which was blooming under Tomáš Masaryk, and put himself into an enormous project to paint Slavic mythology. He painted some 12 paintings, which are so big that Czechs had to build a special building to arrange a special building just for these paintings, because they are something like 6 meters to 8 meters, 10 meters to 12 meters. So the guy who was painting the chocolate boxes, basically, came back, and his Slavic soul exploded. And he, in fact, in this painting, presented all of Slavic mythology and mixed it with Slavic history and with Slavic fairy tales. And this is something that is really interesting. He was, in fact, before many scientists, he understood that Slavic mythology is not to be searched for in mythology. You should search for it in fairy tales. It was delegated to fairy tales or escaped to fairy tales. So fairy tales are the real sources for Slavic mythology. And he represented in this enormous painting all Slavic tribes, all Slavic nations, including all the Balkans. He went to Greece also. He spent some time in Agionoros, in the holy mountain in Greece, in Athos. he was studying very deeply Slavic mythology from all the angles and from all the influences like Roman, like Greek, like Arabic, and so on and so on. And he made a work. When he was done with his work, which was done also with the help of the new Czechoslovakian progressive state and Tomáš Masaryk, sorry, Masaryk himself, he, in fact, was lost. Because in the meantime, that was after the First World War, Czech art, Czechoslovakian art, and Central European art went into a completely new direction. No nation, no dreams of the past, no mythology. They went into Dada, into surrealism, into all kinds of avant-garde movements, and nobody cared about the huge Slavic mythology by Alphonse Mucha. So fortunately, it was packed, well packed, and preserved from Germans. Germans never discovered it during the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and they were packed till very recently. I don't know if this management, if this building where they were placed is already open. If it's open, I go tomorrow to see this. Although I despise nationalism, I despise magnitude, I despise gigantic work of arts, but this is something else. This is from chocolate box to something else. This is how hybridity works. And with this example, I finish. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you so much. We're happy to take some questions. I think maybe also just to conclude, we've talked about hybridity in Slavic mythology. We talked about vampires and werewolves conjoined, but also the idea that each Slavic god is a god covering many different attributes. Yeah. So from the perspective of we who would like to define them specifically, they're effectively hybrid. And also we have this attribute of Christianized versions, or what we have today, and nationalized versions. So hybridity all the way through. Is there anyone with a question for us? Yes, please. Mokosh, probably. Okay. Yeah. You wanna?
No, the etymology of her name is still not established, and etymology is one of the trickiest disciplines of linguistics. And there's no easier way to expose yourself as a linguistic fool as to venture into etymology, which is not well proven. So etymologies are the risky part, and usually the best of etymologists in their dictionaries say origine inconnue. So that's the formula for we don't have the slightest idea.
But Mokosh would be the third one. But she also has attributes of Baba Yaga, who's probably the most famous Slavic mythological figure that people know is Slavic. Vampires and werewolves, most people aren't aware. So those might be the top three. But it gets very messy because they have overlapping attributes, and it depends where you go. Sometimes Vuk is called the main Slavic god, and whether that is as a god form or the concept of a wolf, it depends. And it depends is kind of annoying and unsatisfying, I know.
There's an element which is really interesting when we speak about epitheta and these characteristics of gods. The wolf from Serbian mythology, which is the main god in Serbian mythology specifically, is limping. And limping is the characteristic of wise men in Greek mythology, starting with Oedipus, of course. He is limping. He was exposed when he was a baby, and he's limping. So being not a warrior, being slow, is the sign of being really, really wise and of wisdom. So think about that. There are some of the epitheta which can really trace the history of a certain deity, how he travels from one tribe to another, changes, and so on and so on. And that is why I use the term mythurgy, not mythology, but mythurgy, which is again the Greek term, of course, but is working with myth, not just transferring myth in text or orally, but working with myths, because every telling of the myth is working with the myth. You do something to it. Okay, sorry.
We have just a few more minutes, but a few more questions would be fine, yeah.
Lada. Lada and Vesna. Both of them. They're both springtime and fertility and happy sex.
Anyone else? It's hard to beat that. Happy sex is the ending, but is anyone else with a question? Maybe a more depressing question. We're Slavs after all. Yes?
There was one thing. Well, there's a deity of oaks and mountains. That's a very specific role he plays. And that some scientists are inclined to interpret this as the primarily habitat of Slavs, of all Slavs. That would be Caucasus.
Yes, sir.
There's a lady there.
Oh, sorry. Ladies first, please, yeah. That's a good question.
Yep.
I think it influenced the way I was able to help tell the story, but she's the one who actually knows everything. So what was useful, I think, is that she had to explain it to me, and then together we explained it to the readers. And I think it helps to, there's very little written about Slavic mythology that's available in English, and what there is tends to be Russian. And of course, there are lots of other Slavic mythologies to cover. So trying to convey it in an engaging way that will appeal to readers all over, I think that may be my only American advantage. But it helps that I didn't know it. Sometimes a specialist isn't as good at writing for general readers as someone who has to learn and explain to general readers. And I think that was a good dynamic we had going.
There's another element, and that is the Americans work in a specific way. And I was teaching in America, and I remember my students, who are absolutely the best students I ever met, they would work all the time. So that's him. And another thing, Noah, for me, is the mind who is completely immune to Russian colonization of culture.
Okay, maybe that's the American side too. You had a question?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of Slovenian stuff we entered into the book. Yeah, because we are inclined, because we could, and we wanted to do something. And indirectly, it's the unbelievable figure of Jernej Kopitar, which is behind, and there's clearly said in this book. Jernej Kopitar is an unbelievable scientist, friend, colleague, full of solidarity, full of unbelievable wish to help the other. And he is the one who is responsible for the glory of all the South Slavic languages. And Vuk Karadžić was just his pupil, his loving pupil. So that's one thing that we just wanted to put into to make world think about him. And the other thing is that we entered a number of Slavic myths, and of course the main we did. And in fact, beside Libuše, the Czech mythical person, the Povodni Mož is the only urban myth in our book, and we wanted to have urban myths, and that's a Slovenian part, a very important part. Of course, our version is slightly different from Prešern's version. The girl is not punished. On the contrary, she's awarded by having a water prince who takes her to the south and to the world. So it is a different interpretation, but it is a matter of Slovenian, genuine Slovenian myth, which also covers the huge area of water deities in Slavic mythology. So yes, we insisted we wanted to be Slavic patriots, Slovene patriots, although none of us is.
We snuck in as much Slovenia as we could without making other countries look bad.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
That's a huge question of all mythology researchers. Is the thing original, or is it traveling? Or is it bastard, or is it ours? And there's no answer for that, because myths are travelers, myths are bastards, and they all are ours in sense. There are elements that you can, if you really want to extract that from the myth. But I don't think that's the mainly important thing in myths.
It might be helpful to know early on in our book, we distinguish myths, fairy tales, and folk tales, which we tend to use interchangeably. But there are ways of defining them. The shorthand is myths tend to have happened in an imagined ancient past. Folk tales are passed on orally when we don't know who the author is. And a fairy tale is when we know who the author is. So the Brothers Grimm, they paid a girl to listen to a little old lady who would only tell children, female children, the stories. And she would go and get the little old lady to tell her the stories. Then she'd go tell the Grimm brothers, and they would write it down. And what she was told was a folk tale, and when the Grimm brothers wrote it, it became a fairy tale, the same thing. But it's a little bit like the game of telephone, where you keep on getting generations, in some cases centuries of people telling the story, but then it can change in the telling. And so it's very difficult to know where it goes back to. And an ethnographer might say, well, I read about this in a Slovenian book, but these are so old and they're transferred verbally that it's really hard to tell these things. Okay, we're going to have to stop because another event will be here, but thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.